Hello, I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge. Welcome to another edition of Half Hour on the Hill. I have as my special guest today for a special show, we're going to be talking longer than a half hour, Susan Tordella Williams. Susan is the co-founder of End Mass Incarceration Together, EMIT, which is one of the many criminal justice organizations that had a big success this legislative session in passing what I've heard referred to as the most comprehensive criminal justice reform in about 3 decades. So very proud of that, something that Susan, you and I worked on very closely. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for everything you did to make that bill pass.
Yeah, it was a lot of organizing, and of course you are not only a friend but a constituent living in Ayer, and you know, I really wanted to have you on to sort of reflect on the organizing that really happened over the past 5 years, because it really took that level of organizing across the state to pass such a comprehensive bill.
Do you think 5 years was fast or slow to pass this kind of bill?
I actually think it was relatively fast. Yes. Yep. So it you know, normally I would have thought maybe 10 years. So yeah, I know. So don't let that stop you on your continued efforts. But I do really respect all of your efforts, and I want to talk a little bit about how we first met, because I think one of the things I really try to emphasize with my constituents, the general public, people, especially people who are concerned about what's going on in the country and in the state, is sort of, you know, how to be sort of a visionary but pragmatic activist and make a difference, and the value of organizing and social protests. So we met on an issue not related to criminal justice reform.
Well, back to your first comment about how to get something done, there's an African saying, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together.
I like that a lot, and that's what happened with this criminal justice reform bill.
Yeah, it was a huge push together of a lot of people. So we met, I guess it was 10 years ago.
I know, I think I was just becoming a state senator. Yep.
Yeah, and there was a water issue in Ayer, my town, and Littleton actually. And it had to do with the federal government and the railroad's right to build, and the railroad in question had a very bad track record, environmental track record of reporting spills, cleaning up spills. And one of our ways of being an activist, and there are many, to call attention to the problem was at the Ayer Rotary.
Yes.
You're familiar with that. What is that, 110, 111? Yeah.
Right off Route 2. Yep.
Right. We had on Friday nights the aquifer bar, because we were protecting our aquifer, and we had bottles of dirty water.
Yep, I remember. Yeah.
And the first time I met you, you showed up at the aquifer bar for a drink.
Yep.
On a Friday night at 5 o'clock.
No, I remember it well. I remember there was great signs and really highlighted the concern about contamination, I think related to the railroad, right? The new rail station.
Yes, the possible contamination, and like I say, their track record. And I was really impressed. You just showed up, you heard about it, somehow you have your feelers out in the district, and you were concerned enough, you were interested enough that you wanted to connect and find out what was going on. And from there, you definitely helped us and did as much as you could fighting against the federal government and railroads.
And major railroad companies.
Two big entities. Yeah, which is kind of outside of your jurisdiction because you're a state senator. However, you did open some doors, I think, to connect us with our federal representatives.
Yep, I did.
Yeah. Was Nikki Songus in power then?
She was. Yep.
Yeah.
She was a relatively new congresswoman, and that's how we met. And I think, you know, to me, it was just sort of how I see my role as a legislator is that, you know, when there's a group of people who are concerned, it's a legislator's, you know, duty and responsibility to meet with that group and follow through and really believe what they're saying. So I certainly did it in that case, and then of course we came to work on criminal justice reform. But I'm trying to think about how did you first get involved in that issue?
I started out as a prison volunteer because I live what I call in the land of cheap prisons, cheap land, and it's far enough from the city in Ayer and Shirley and Devons where you can build prisons on cheaper land, and I was volunteering. And I'm a member of First Church Unitarian in Littleton, and everything happens at coffee hour if you're Unitarian. Okay, we don't have communion, we have the coffee pot, okay, and goodies. And somebody at coffee hour had been to a big meeting of fellow Unitarians in the US. It was 2012, and she said, "Susan, you have to read this book." And she just gave me the title, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. Well, when Monica tells me something to do, I do it. And I had been volunteering in prison for about 3 years by then. And I was so angry and so upset by what I read, I decided I had to put on the activist hat again and start to take action, as big, thorny, and hairy as the problem is. And luckily no state senator said, "Oh, this could take you 10 years."
I didn't reveal a number of years, that's right.
Thank you.
Yep. And tell me about the New Jim Crow. You gave that book out to all legislators. I have a copy. It's a very powerful read.
Well, so the first thing we did as activists was to educate people, to make them aware of the problem. I didn't know about the problem. I didn't know about the historic events that led up to it, and the number of laws that were passed by different presidents, and the number of policies, and the
war on drugs.
The war on drugs, the industrialization of our police. There's so many things that fed into this, and it's a huge industry to incarcerate people, to prosecute, arrest, and incarcerate people.
It's a moneymaker for a lot of people.
We spend, more than $600 million a year just on prisons and jails in Massachusetts. Yeah.
And obviously the title is sort of referring to the argument that the war on drugs is a way to continue to incarcerate particularly African Americans and I believe Latino Americans.
Right. And other activists trace back the fact that people were freed from slavery, then they faced the Jim Crow era where they said separate but equal, and it really wasn't.
It wasn't, right.
Yeah, it's different schools, different job opportunities, different housing, and so the discrimination continued. And the war on drugs and just the whole development of the criminalization, the prosecution society. And becoming overly Puritan and saying, "Oh, you printed out a copy of a little girl in Russia at a beach on a public library. You're now a sex offender, and we're going to incarcerate you for 5 or 10 years at a cost of $50,000 to $70,000 a year per inmate." That's crazy. So it goes bigger than race, and race is a big part. I mean, if you're black or brown, you're much more likely to be incarcerated and for longer. And you can look at the statistics. But at one of our workshops, and you might have been there in Arlington, afterwards, you made the suggestion, "Susan, you ought to put this on every legislator's desk at the State House." Do you remember that?
I do. And you raised the money and you gave a book to every legislator.
We raised it as a team.
Yep.
Teamwork. That right there, we took a collection at that meeting, and we made private donations to the First Church Unitarian in Littleton. We gave some money. It was only 200 copies.
Yep, 200 legislators. Yep.
That's right. And so, Jamie, you've really been in it from the beginning. Do you remember our first caucus that we had, the first briefing? I mean, not caucus, the briefing.
Well, I was going to say, I remember our first meeting, or one of our first meetings at the state, I was talking about that a lot of people don't know how to interact with legislators, right?
Oh, that's right.
Yep, and we did a mock interaction to talk about mandatory minimums, about unfair drug laws, and sort of did a role play.
Right, and you've taught me a lot. Okay, like you said, "Susan, it has to be statewide." "Susan, how many people did you get to meet face to face with their state legislator this week or this month?"
Right.
And you showed me how to be a leader and how to empower others, because you call me up every couple weeks. "Susan, did you get outside of Boston?" And I put a lot of miles on my car.
And I know that because I talked to a fair amount of my colleagues that you have met directly with them. So you've maybe brought in constituents of theirs to meet, or maybe gone slightly outside this district and met with legislators.
What'd your colleagues say?
Only good things. Only good things. Yep. Yep. This is what it takes to move the dial on a difficult issue. Yep.
Or an issue people didn't know about.
Right.
So since we started 5 years ago, it's become a lot more in the forefront.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when did you found
EMIT?
EMIT, yep.
2013. So the first year I kind of dated around to see what other activist groups were doing. And then this basically is Unitarian Universalist roots. And we use Unitarian Universalist churches as our base I've preached from the pulpit. We've had informational meetings. We've had the constituent meetings. So that pretty much was our base. And we don't have a dogma. In the Unitarian Church, you can believe whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt others. We have atheists, we have Wiccas, we have Jutarians, Bootarians, former Christians. Yeah.
And so you formed EMIT, and then it became a partnership with the Harm Reduction Jugular Reform Caucus, which I co-founded with former State Representative Tom Sannicandro about 4 years ago to have these briefings at the State House.
And you're going to explain the difference between a briefing and a hearing at the State House? Do your constituents know that?
They might not, but yeah, a briefing is an opportunity, usually just in a meeting room, to have a presentation that anyone can come to, but it's informal. It's not a formal hearing where you're actually hearing specific legislation or there's a direct action. It's just a educational forum. Right.
So a hearing is when a committee wants to hear input on a bill that has been proposed. One of the 6,000 or 7,000 bills that gets presented each 18-month session. See how much you've taught me?
Yeah, yeah. Not everybody knows this, yeah.
And I'd never heard of a briefing. So the first briefing we had, do you remember it?
Forgive me, remind me.
Jack Cole.
Oh, of course, yeah.
See, that's one thing about this movement. I didn't realize I would meet so many interesting activists.
And people had been at this for decades, yeah.
I'm a newcomer. And they came at it from many different roads, okay? Yep. Jack Cole came at it as a former drug cop. He made many arrests. He said he wrecked many lives. And then he realized what he was doing was ruining lives. He wasn't ending the drug war. He was not solving the problem.
Yep. And the problem being that, if there are people in society that use drugs, and if you make that illegal or there is severe penalties, it's going to drive a lot of people into prison that maybe, if they got treatment, they could put their lives back on a more productive path.
And what most people, including some of your fellow legislators, don't realize is most drug dealers are also users, and they're not the big kingpins.
They're small time. Exactly.
Right, so maybe I have a little bit, a small amount, can I sell some to you and it'll defray my costs? It's a little bit like network marketing. And it helps pay for my product, you're happy, I'm happy, and it's just a little business to keep me getting my next fix, unfortunately.
And it's an example of what happens with an addiction where it's you can't stop, unless you get treatment.
Yeah, so. And it's hard, and people, the addicts I've met, it's taken more than one time into treatment. It's really tough. So Jack co-founded Law Enforcement Against Prohibition of Drugs.
Yes.
Because real libertarians believe you should be able to put anything you want in your body. Why is the government telling us what we can put in our bodies? So Jack gave his slideshow and a talk. And we provided maybe lunch or snacks, can't remember.
Right, you provided lunch for the caucus, and it was a great turnout. And we, still today have about 70 legislators who are part of the caucus.
There was no caucus when Jack came. The caucus eventually, it's been a road. It's been a journey. Yeah,
that's true.
And I learned how to be a better caterer because food brings, as I used to like to say, the rats out of their cubicles to come and hear.
And when you did interact with legislators early on, what were some of the reactions? What were some of the comments, especially from those who might not have yet fully embraced criminal justice reform?
Wow.
Was it a variety of views, or?
It was really interesting. Like you made.
You don't have to name any names.
I won't. You made the point earlier that you felt it was incumbent on you to meet with constituents who had a concern, who want the state to pass some kind of protection or reform to make the society better for everyone.
Sure.
Not all legislators are like Jamie Eldridge. There were many legislators who I would find the constituents, take your task, find people throughout the state, and call their legislators and ask for a face-to-face meeting. Not an email, not a letter, not a group meeting, a face-to-face meeting like this with their state rep. The most powerful way to influence your state senator,
often in his or her
rep.
district. Yep. Absolutely.
Well, and they should want to listen to us because maybe we'll run against them. Because if we're that impassioned that we're an activist.
Well, I think it's more about though, that they represent you and they need to respond to your concerns. So.
And not everyone responded.
But talking about those that you did have meetings with, what were the range of comments about criminal justice reform or maybe ending the war on drugs?
Most of them wouldn't commit.
Okay.
Most of them took the information and learned because they didn't know, but like me, like many people, I don't know how you found out about the problem. They learned about the problem, so that was the first step, was to educate. And then I would always ask the person or the people, we usually try to get a small group to meet with the state rep or the state senator, and we would say, can you call 5 of your friends, and get them to contact your state rep.
Yeah.
And it was about the House of Representatives, right? Not so much the Senate.
Well, I think the Senate needed help as well. Yeah, I mean, it was just a few years ago that the Senate, passed a criminal justice reform bill that some of us voted against because it increased penalties for certain crimes. So
it's such a complex problem.
It is. Yep, it's a difficult issue. I think we've discussed this before, and actually I had another, now former constituent, but still a friend, who really educated me about the issue, a woman named Bonnie DeToro.
That's right.
From Lunenburg, which I represented when I was a state rep, whose mother, who by then was in her late 70s, came to meet with me and say her daughter had received a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years for something that she believed that she was innocent of, and I believe her too, that the judge had no choice but to sentence her to 15 years, take her away from her 2 kids. She just barely got to see her father before he passed away. She was in jail for well over 10 years. So that's for really something that at the end of the day was an addiction. So. And
I thought it somehow involved her boyfriend and his stash and her car.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And 10 years, we wrecked someone's life, and the state had to bear the cost of that. Not only and the kids, her family had to bear the brunt of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those personal stories really have an impact, and even if maybe someone hasn't been incarcerated, being an advocate like yourself, founding an organization like EMIT, really can have impact.
Well, one of the things I learned as a prison volunteer, there but for the grace of whoever, go you or I.
Right.
Maybe I'm doing something on my cell phone and I accidentally kill somebody. Now that's called vehicular manslaughter. Maybe I get a little angry at my husband and I throw a frying pan at him. That's assault and battery with a dangerous weapon.
Right, and getting caught up in the judicial system.
Yeah, or maybe my kid in the next room is fooling around with a gun with their friend.
Yep.
A fellow activist has had that happen and got her tangled up in the legal system. I've heard so many stories and met people like Bonnie.
Yep. Yeah, we had Bonnie come and speak at one of the briefings.
Wow, that was going back. That was a while ago.
Yeah.
And as we were saying earlier, it takes a lot of courage for someone who has been incarcerated to speak in front of people because the shame is so great. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. So as someone that was, helping with a lot of the briefings, we were meeting regularly, you were doing advocacy, what to you, in the criminal justice reform bill are the most important pieces, the most meaningful, especially given that you've been a prison volunteer?
The first thing that comes to mind is solitary, the reform. It's not as strong as we wanted it, but that's politics, right? You don't get everything you wanted.
Right. Yep, exactly.
You were asking we had the range of, I won't meet with you to, oh, gee, I'm on your page.
Yep,
okay.
I agree with you, right.
Yeah, and solitary is terrible, or whatever else we're talking about. one of the analogies I use is just imagine yourself locked in your bathroom for 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, with someone antagonistic and a little hole at the door.
Yeah, with often no access to books, to programs. Yep.
TV, radio. I mean, I'm somewhat normal. That would make me crazy.
Yep.
And a lot of times people's mental illness are put in that situation. They only become worse. It costs as much as 50% more to put someone in solitary. And then it kind of becomes, maybe now that person incarcerated becomes a repeat customer because they're less mentally stable.
Yeah,
and
the trauma from being in solitary, even just after 1 week, is documented.
Well, the UN says more than 2 weeks is cruel and unusual punishment. Could you put your dog in there for more than a day?
Right.
The dog would go nuts. So there was some reform on solitary. Senator Brownsberger of Belmont really became acutely aware of the criminalization of poverty. So I met people who are out of jail finally. They have no resources. I mean, $75 is a lot of money to them.
And a record that's a barrier to getting a job or
lack of
going to school.
education, lack of confidence, addiction, whatever. And they can't make their parole fee. Now they go back to jail. For a $75 a month parole fee, and jail is about $120, $150 a day.
The fine time, which was an issue in investigation that Senator Barrett did.
That's crazy. Also, another one related to poverty is bail. So I've been involved with, part of being an activist is networking with other groups. And I got involved with the bail fund, which still exists, unfortunately, because it's needed. And so someone gets arrested, maybe from Acton, probably not, and they can't post bail. So now they are incarcerated till their trial, which could be 1, 3, 5, 10, 19 months away. Maybe they lose their apartment, their job, their kids, again, creating a burden on the state, wrecking a family, wrecking, you know, what's going to happen to these poor kids? So the first person the bail fund helped was a woman, a homeless woman arrested for trespassing. She didn't have $100 of bail. So we bailed her out.
And where was she trespassing?
I don't know. I don't know the details.
Yeah.
So we give up to $500. We don't have enough. You can look up Mass Bail Fund on online and make a donation, because the money gets recycled when they show up for court, and most of our people have showed up for court, almost all of them. Now I know one piece that you're particularly excited about. I want to hear what you're excited about. I know restorative justice is one of your big ones.
Absolutely, something I worked on for the past 8 years. So predating sort of the formation of the Harm Reduction Drug Law Reform Caucus. But in Concord, there is a non-profit called Communities for Restorative Justice. C4RJ.
Yes.
Yep. And so that focuses on an alternative to arresting someone and bringing someone through the court process that could get a record. Instead, they're diverted by police chiefs, by prosecutors, to what's called a restorative justice circle, which I've participated in Concord. And about 13 communities, including Acton, Boxborough, Harvard, Ayer, I think, and Concord, Arlington, where the person, usually a young person, goes through a restorative justice circle, and then if he or she follows the recommendations of the restorative justice circle, properly appreciates the harm he or she caused, they don't get a record. And the statistics from other countries and other states that have restorative justice show that the recidivism rate is much lower for those who go through restorative justice. And
is it only limited to young people? Are older people ever able to go through restorative justice?
They are, and let's take a break and we can talk about that when we come back.
Okay, I have a good example on it too that I often use when talking to your fellow legislators, because they didn't know what restorative justice was. Yeah, so a big part of what we do is education.
So we've reached the break for what is really an hour on the Hill, and we'll be back in a moment.
They said I have troll teeth.
That my voice sounded like a possessed baby doll.
That no one would ever love someone as stupid as me.
That I was fat, ugly,
Disgusting. The effect of bullying is potent.
We will no longer be the silent majority.
Now, when you see online bullying, there's something you can do about it.
We're gonna take action with the I.
I am a witness.
I am a witness.
I am a witness.
I am a witness.
I am a witness, and so are you.
Welcome back to the second half of Half Hour on the Hill. I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge. Have as my guest Susan Tordella Williams, the co-founder of END Mass Incarceration Together. We're talking about sort of your early roots in criminal justice reform and activism, and we were talking about some of the different bills that actually made it into law in the criminal justice reform package. We were talking about my first introduction to restorative justice. So after I sort of participated in restorative justice circles, saw the value, saw the commitment of Middlesex District Attorney Marian Ryan to expand the program, I filed legislation to make it a statewide option. And it was interesting because initially the bill had a fairly narrow scope in terms of the list of crimes that people would be eligible for. And really what happened through the organizing process is recognizing that restorative justice was a powerful program, even for some more serious crimes. Someone might still be going to jail, but for them to participate in restorative justice could be very powerful. So that's a bill that passed into law as part of the comprehensive criminal justice system. So now it's a statewide option, and so what my focus now is getting other district attorneys, other police chiefs to adopt it, especially in the western part of my district.
So are they required, or is it still only an option to go through a restorative justice process?
It's still an option, and the victims generally have to consent. They have to agree. What most experience have shown is the victims actually better appreciate restorative justice because they get to confront the person who caused them harm, understand why the person caused them harm, and have a more holistic solution versus the court process where often there's no interaction at all due to legal protections, and the person might get a fine, but the responsible party might not even appreciate the harm that he or she has caused.
Can I give an example that I often use?
Sure, absolutely.
So one of the big things we did as activists when forming these meetings that you coached us to do and mentored us, I mean, you have been a really strong mentor for our group of statewide activists and other activists. So I just really want to thank you for that and really appreciate your commitment to making this happen. I think you're behind the scenes. You weren't on the
Judiciary Committee.
Yet you were behind the scenes, and I learned that's a big part of what happens on the Hill is legislators influencing and educating other legislators. So this example of restorative justice happened in Arlington, Massachusetts, and a troubled young man, clearly about 16 or whatever, he threw a brick through a hardware store window and broke it. And the next day the hardware store owner was quite angry, and somehow they caught the kid. And both the hardware store owner and the young man agreed to a restorative justice process, which is what you said, it's a circle, and there is often a police officer, a social worker, perhaps the parents, if it's a minor, the person who is the victim. Anybody else there in the
Sometimes
circle?
police officer, sometimes a social worker,
Usually,
teacher.
And each person gets to talk about the impact the crime had on them. And it caused the business owner quite a bit of inconvenience and expense. And then they decide on a way to restore it, what's it
repair
called?
the harm.
Repair the harm. And the young man was offered a job by the hardware store owner to work off the cost of the window.
In the hardware store?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
So that
great.
had a real happy ending. I don't know what happened to him afterwards. And instead of him entering this pipeline of incarceration and having many doors closed to you and becoming more of a criminal, possibly, it usually happens. So restorative justice, I'd never heard of it until I got active and got interested in the problem. So
and there, if I could add, there's just examples of, high school students or young people spray painting a swastika on a temple, not properly appreciating or knowing about the Holocaust. There is, examples of, I think it was in Arlington where someone damaged a Black Lives Matter sign at one of the Arlington churches.
It was at the Arlington Unitarian Universalist Church
Yeah.
where we have a lot of our meetings to inform people and to become more aware
Sure.
of the problem and to take action. It
Yep.
was at that church, if
Yeah.
you can believe it.
And the person, instead of that person, having some sort of criminal sentence or record, they went through restorative justice and better appreciated the history of racism in our country.
Okay, so you asked before, what am I excited about that passed in the bill?
Yes.
So there's a difference between a misdemeanor and a felony. If you commit a felony, that record used to follow you for 10 years, and the felony was $250 or more in property. It had
Right.
not been raised since 1984.
I think so, yep.
Right. So the Senate version of the bill said raise it to 1,500, right? The House version of the bill said raise it to
1,200, I think. Or, yeah.
What did we end
Maybe
up
it was
at?
1,000, I think it ended up at 1,200. Yep.
Yeah. Some states
Yeah.
have it as high as 2,000. Because a misdemeanor is a lesser penalty, and then it only follows you for 7 years, not 10.
Yep.
So then it's wiped from your record. So we were pretty excited about that.
Yep.
To update that, because someone stole my cell phone.
Yeah,
Now they're a felon?
Yep.
Shouldn't a felon be a worse crime?
exactly. And as someone who is a prison volunteer, we also had to have more training requirements and more educational opportunities for prisoners, including those in solitary confinement.
Right.
And there's also the medical release provision. So if someone is in prison, is probably in their 70s or 80s, has a terminal illness, they would be able to be released and have the last moments of their lives with their loved ones, while also saving the state a lot of money.
Well, I'll give you the figures. You probably know them. Okay, so to be incarcerated normally it's 50 to 60,000, depending on your rate of security and your level, whether you're medium or maximum security. If you're ill and you have to be transported, 2 correctional officers have to go with you every time you have to go to the hospital. They don't have the facilities in the institution to really take care of you properly. And it just adds up to like 150,000 a year, and it's really a budget buster.
Sure.
And they could possibly be put into a home, a nursing home, and Medicare would take over the payments, pass the buck, but it's about 120,000 a year, which is
Sure.
a lot more reasonable, maybe even less, or maybe they can get home care.
Excuse me.
But like you said, usually the person is terminally ill. Bless
Exactly.
you. Yeah. So
that provision's
Do you
in there.
think it's going to happen? Because it looked like it has to go through a number of authorities for that person to be released on medical release.
Well, we just recently had a forum on criminal justice reform with Public Safety Secretary Bennett, and he talked about the provisions. So I'm cautiously optimistic that the Department of Corrections will will allow people to be released and spend the last moments of their lives with their loved ones.
Was that Tuesday?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I missed that.
Yep.
So one of the things I was driven to do as an activist, after 4 years of just no movement,
Right.
except education, was to develop my Justice Jackal costume. I think I have a picture with you in my full body fursuit,
Right.
with
Yep.
here's my orange T-shirt that
Yep.
said, I'm the Justice Jackal. I prey upon people with low income, low education, possibly substance abuse disorder, and may have a mental illness and is black or brown skinned. That's who the justice system preys upon. They're easy targets.
When you go to a typical courthouse, yep, that's generally the demographic. That's generally the population.
And
Yep.
that's generally the population in prison.
Yeah.
So again, being punished for being poor. So
Exactly.
some of the incarcerated people are also excited that more programs are mandated to
Yep.
better prepare them for release.
Sure. Absolutely.
Solitary reform, yes, people get thrown in solitary for anything. It's just,
Yep,
it's
right.
used like a baseball bat when a feather would do. I think they were interested in no more parole and probation fees. If you're in prison, it didn't seem like there was a lot that would benefit you. What do you think of your knowledge of this 100-page bill?
Right. It has a lot of elements to it. Yep. There is some language around reducing some fees, giving judges more leeway to offer waivers for certain fees. But no, it has a lot of pieces. We just recently I had a meeting with Representative Mary Keefe, who's the current House Chair of the Harm Reduction Drug Law Reform Caucus, about what is next going forward. And I'm curious, I know Representative Keefe and I spoke a little bit about it, but what would you like to see, whether the caucus or the legislature work on, whether it's the criminal justice law or other things you'd like us to look at?
Well, it's funny, I had a question for you. It's on the same lines. How are we going to make the prisons and the system follow what the law says?
Yep, and that's exactly what Mary Keefe and I talked about, is holding the Baker-Polito administration responsible, holding our sheriffs responsible for, implementing the reforms, having a focus on treatment over incarceration, helping someone, get back on their feet so when they're released from jail, they can be a productive member of society. So that's a big piece. Big savings too. The third or fourth highest spending item in the budget usually is around prisons, around the Department of Corrections. So it's something that's taking away money from education, from healthcare, from the environment.
The biggest expense is healthcare.
Healthcare.
Second is education.
Education.
Third is incarceration.
It's usually incarceration. Yep.
$600 million a year.
Yep.
So my question is to the Department of Corrections is, $600 million goes in, they spend it, they use it, okay, and what comes out? Not too much correction.
And not exactly, there's no accountability.
No.
Exactly.
They did change their motto from manage, care, and, wait a minute, I have it down here. It was manage, care, and prepare. Now it's manage, care, program, prepare. But I have an idea on that.
Yeah.
Now, new ideas are typically first ridiculed.
Yes, that's what we saw with criminal justice reform, right?
Oh yeah, it's impossible, or yeah. What if every correctional officer was a correctional instructor officer, and they had a more collegial, colloquial relationship with the incarcerated people?
Absolutely.
And they had a skill to share.
And I know that there are a number of correction officers that want to play more of that role to help.
Really, I'd like to meet them. Can you
Yeah.
introduce me?
Absolutely, absolutely, happy to.
Wow. And I've learned that's one of the most important things you do as a legislator. You make connections. You listen. You answer phone calls. You meet with us.
Help connect people. Exactly.
Yeah, you help make things happen. It might not always be on the front page, or it's funny what gets on the front page about what happens at the State House.
Right. No, that's true. That's
Yeah.
true. But yeah, so we want to do accountability. I will say some of the newer areas, talk about the prison system is, I know that another great activist, Shar Simpson, pretty well. And in the budget, I have filed an amendment to fund restorative justice that would be at MCI Norfolk, called Resolve to Stop the Violence Project, RSVP. That would be a very comprehensive restorative justice program for men who they're unlikely to get out of prison, but how do you improve that behavior within the walls?
Did you know I went down to New York to visit the RSVP program in the Westchester County Jail?
Yes, I remember. Talk to me about it.
Right, and it's more than restorative justice. I think RSVP, I don't think it's really restorative justice. Sometimes victims come and talk to them, the people who've committed the crimes. However, it's more about the person learning about the violence within them. And maybe they were raised with someone who, if they misbehaved, they experienced violence, or they were just neglected. And they learned the only way to survive was to fight. And sometimes it has to do with manhood. And sometimes mothers, I've heard stories from incarcerated people, the mother says, did that girl beat you up? Did she take your lunch money? You go out there and beat her up. Don't come back here. Boy, till that, whatever. And so the men, and it's primarily men in this program, have to learn what triggers their violent response.
Sure, right.
And how to change it. And I know we've had briefings
Yep.
with good food at the State House on this
course.
to educate people. Because if violence has caused you to get into this problem or addiction, how can we, like you were saying, how can we treat it?
Exactly.
Instead of just punish you.
Exactly. And speaking of treatment, good segues, talking about addiction, which, I was just out in Shirley for another forum on opioid addiction. I had met with constituents and now friends of mine, Marianne and Gary Prince in Shirley, that lost their son Travis to heroin. And I met with a number of other parents in Shirley who've also lost their loved ones. One of the areas that we're focused on is the supervised injection sites, the ability for someone who has an addiction to go to a site where there's a doctor there to make sure the person is not ODing, and then also giving them information that leads to treatment. It's working in Vancouver now, so we're looking at, can that be something we do in Massachusetts?
Go ahead.
And then, I'm sorry, if I could add, is Senator Cindy Friedman, who is the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Mental Health and Substance Abuse, is working on medically assisted treatment in the prisons.
Right,
So
like
should prisoners-
Suboxone and Vivitrol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So making that legal, so that could be done in our prisons.
Maybe your viewers don't realize each of the 14 sheriffs and how many jails? 11 county jails. It's
I
a
believe so.
fiefdom. It's a fiefdom. They can do whatever they want in their jail.
There's not a lot of oversight. Yep, I agree.
They only respond to the voters. I didn't know that a sheriff's job was to run the county jail. And if they don't want Vivitrol or Suboxone in their jail, there is none. Some jails
Yep.
have more programs than others. Each jail is its own little fiefdom. So our sheriff in Middlesex County is Peter Katushin, who used to be a state rep.
Yep. And he was a big supporter of criminal justice reform, so greatly
He
appreciate his
is,
leadership.
and he's in that position now. And the Billerica House of Corrections is our county jail, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I've learned from my time as a volunteer that the people who run these institutions, they like to say, they like to keep it, what happens in prison stays in prison. Kind of like when we were working on the water issue, the railroads are in the backwoods, the back countries, the swamps.
right.
That's where all the prisons and jails are.
Often, yep, that's very
And
true.
it's
Yeah.
hard to get in. It's hard even as a volunteer to get credentialed to go in and run a program. There's so many roadblocks. Again, it's a system that provides a lot of jobs for people. And they feed off of people who are repeat offenders. And our rate of recidivism is what? About, what, is it more than half return
I
to jail
believe it
within
is, yep.
3 years? Yeah, 650 million. More than half return. For 50 to 60,000, we could send them at least to Middlesex Community College.
Right, yeah.
And,
Yep,
give them
exactly.
tuition, room, and board. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And then there's the other piece of when prisoners are released, how are they being retrained? Are they learning a trade? Are they being able to go to school? So there is a slight expansion of programs in the criminal justice reform law. I would like to see this budget, or maybe next session, let's invest more in those programs, and certainly let's not build any more prisons.
Well, again, I agree with that. No more prisons.
Yeah.
When they're in prison, to learn, to have the opportunity for more vocational education, GED, everything. A lot of times they're not allowed to take a program to the very end of their sentence. It's a little bit too little, too late.
Yeah,
But
or if they get transferred, or
if every correctional officer brought something to the table, GED tutoring, yoga, car repair,
Sure.
stamp collecting, mindfulness, I don't care. Just so that people have so many opportunities to improve as a
Yep.
human being and gain skills.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the part of the next wave of criminal justice reform. There's still a lot to do.
How are we
There's
going to
still a lot
make that
do.
happen, Jamie?
Well, I know that we'll still be having these harm reduction drug law reform briefings. Are you going to keep going forward with EMIT?
I've formed a subgroup of EMIT called
Okay.
Prison Accountability Task Force
Okay.
to work on making sure that the prisons do what this 120-page bill says they ought to be doing.
Excellent. Yeah.
We're going to be busy.
Yep. Absolutely.
Maybe I need a gun too, so I can go in and make sure.
Well, I don't recommend that, but I will say that for the caucus, Representative Keefe and I, first of all, we've already been visiting prisons. I think our plan now is to, take a little stronger look at certain prisons. You have at MCA Norfolk, you have complaints from the prisoners about the water being brown and unsafe to drink. You have some prisons where there's a high suicide rate, and not just by the prisoners, but by the correction officers as well. And you have facilities like MCA Framingham, where I have heard many stories that the facilities is not in good condition for the women, for the female prisoners. So what are we doing to address
Right.
that?
Well, let's let some of the men out and the women could take over one of the existing facilities instead of
Sure.
building new. I mean, it costs a fortune to
Yeah,
build new.
we want to, yep, absolutely oppose any new prisons.
Have you been out to Hampden County?
I have,
Because
yes.
I've heard they offer a lot of programs there.
They do. Well, you know, the Western Mass prisons, district attorneys have often been a model, and yet not a lot of people know about that. So we've gone out to the Hampden County prisoners. We've met with Western District Attorney David Sullivan, who's a terrific DA. So, but we're also lucky here in Middlesex County. Marion Ryan, I feel, is doing some good reforms, but there needs to be more.
How about a briefing by the Hampden County dudes and women to bring them to the State House and invite, or just even a meeting to invite the other
Absolutely.
sheriffs to find out what they're doing? Because a fellow activist said that the jail isn't that full. A fellow activist I met because you said this had to be a statewide movement.
And that's what you did. Yep.
Wow. Well, we did as well as we can with a spider to reach out and build our web as far as we could.
Yep.
It's been really interesting, and I really appreciate your mentorship and your open door. You know.
Well, no, I just think that if you're really serious about passing comprehensive reform, unless you have the public with you, unless you have, as you said earlier, a statewide approach of progressive activists or concerned residents, whoever you want to call them, it's unlikely you're going to have major reform. You're going to have, we do reforms in lots of areas, but unless you have the grassroots behind you, it's less likely that it'll be bold and visionary.
Well, one of the big things I've learned at the State House is that legislators like to stick in a flock. You're safer, because if you're straying from the flock, you might get picked off, or what's that person doing out there? So if the whole flock moved toward this reform.
Right, exactly.
5 years, I should be jumping for joy. It was only a 5-year effort. It puts a whole different take on it.
Absolutely. And I see you brought some other books with you.
Well,
Do
this
you want
is
to just talk about
sure. This
one?
is one by Andrea James. She is a woman of color from Roxbury who turned herself into the feds for wiretap fraud.
She was a lawyer. Yeah,
Yes.
it was a white-collar crime.
And
yeah.
I think she was doing something to do with mortgages during that whole mortgage thing. And we believe if she had been a different gender and a different race, she may just have gotten a rap on the knuckles and not had to serve 2 years in jail. But she wrote this book, Upper Bunkies Unite. It's available on Amazon. And she has become an incredible international and national activist.
Yeah, and she has her own organization.
She
in
does.
Boston. Yep.
It's called Justice, I can't remember, but Andrea James, just Google Andrea James. She'll
Yep.
come speak. In fact, I hope her rates, Families for Justice is Healing. That's
Yes.
her organization.
Yes. Yep.
So, and then I also brought a Toastmaster Manual, which is the program that I do in prison, which
Yeah.
helps empower people
Yeah.
and, gain greater self-confidence, learn how to work together on a team.
How many
And-
years have you done that?
Since '09.
Okay.
And it also offers volunteers the opportunity to meet incarcerated people as human beings.
Sure. I think that's a big piece. I think a lot of elected officials don't think that they have formerly incarcerated people in their district. They don't think that it's impacted a loved one that lives in the region. So having that interaction, talking about the experience, about the really negative experience of being in prison and what it does to you, and it has an effect even once you're released from prison.
Yeah, and how do you get over that shame, the loss of those years, the loss of the relationships? Somebody this week when I was volunteering said, it's not, are there good, the question was, are there good people in prison? He said, yeah, there are good people in prison. They've just made dumb, bad decisions.
Yep, absolutely. People like Bonnie DeToro, who maybe got caught up in the addiction, maybe had the wrong boyfriend, and then suddenly she's sentenced to jail for 15 years.
But I would encourage prison or jail volunteering because it has been one of the most impactful experiences in my life to have the opportunity. It really is a privilege to volunteer and mentor people, offer a hand up, meet them as equals, open doors for people who might not have that opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so I know that a lot of members of your church are also volunteers, which is great. Hopefully that spreads. I have a lot of constituents that volunteer at the different prisons in my district as well as MCI Concord. So that's a step, but I think, to me what you're such a shining example of is it's not just volunteering, but it's political activism. It's, at the end of the day, it's the legislature that changes these laws. It's about being political and not just supporting, a charitable effort of volunteering, but being politically active. So I just want to thank you so much for being on the show. This is my longest show I've ever had, and I knew I would need that with you because of all your great work. So. Well,
and I just want to say, as an activist, to have you as my state senator has been a real privilege and an honor, and it makes it easier. Everyone says, call your state senator. Well, I'm pretty sure, as one of the leading progressives on Beacon Hill, that you care about people who weren't maybe born with the same opportunities you and I were born with, and maybe down on their luck.
Well, thank you.
And you really do care, and I've seen that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
And we've reached the end of the half hour on the Hill with myself, Senator Jamie Eldridge. So thanks for joining us. And again, thanks to my guest, Susan Tordella Williams.